Well, hello and welcome to this week's episode of Political State from the Oklahoman. I'm Ben Felder here in the Oklahoman's news studio, video studio in downtown. Joining me this week, Dale and Justin, who are off, joining me this week as my guest who's going to fill in for them, is Clark Frailey, who's the Executive Director of Pastors for Oklahoma Kids. And Clark, first off, thanks so much for your time and joining us for this week's episode.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
I want to talk to you about your organization. Okay. I also want to talk to you a little bit about just kind of the intersection of politics and religion, which is a pretty prevalent issue in a lot of parts of the country, but especially here in Oklahoma. Right. I feel like if we're going to really dissect Oklahoma politics, it's almost impossible to do so without talking a little bit about religion, specifically the evangelical church, and just kind of its size and its impact here in Oklahoma. Let's save that for a little bit later in the episode, but let's first start by talking about your organization, Pastors for Oklahoma Kids, which you are now the executive director of, a two-year organization. First, tell us a little bit about the background of this organization and kind of how we got to where you are right now.
Sure. So it's just briefly, it's a pretty cool story, but in 2016, I was kind of in the midst of working with local schools, and we were noticing their needs were changing from items that we wanted to donate at the beginning of the year, kind of like K-cups and things for teacher lounges, to they were saying we don't have copy paper early in the year. And so we would come in the fall and say, how can we bless the school? That's all we wanted to do. We wanted to try to just help the school out. We don't have Kleenex, we don't have copy paper. And I thought, this is a weird transition. Why is this happening? Why are they running out of things they should be easily? I thought, is this mismanagement? What's going on? You know, I didn't know as an outsider. And so started telling my church, so we started doing copy paper drives and things like that. And then in the wake of a state question that we had at that time that was supposed to help funding, because we kind of realized, okay, there's a funding crisis. 2016 rolls around, we realized that.
Statewide, the sales tax that would go towards teacher pay and some other education funding.
And when that failed, and then kind of the rhetoric that came out of that, and at the same time, I should mention, there was some things coming out of a state rep that had said something in an email about atheist-based schools. There was also a pastor who'd written an article in the Tulsa World that had mentioned that you got to pull your kids out of schools. And I was thinking, this is not the Oklahoma I know, and these are not the teachers I know. I mean, the teachers in our local public schools are in our church nursery working. They're teaching our kids on Sundays. They're our best volunteers because they're already community-minded. And I thought, boy, I have a big disconnect with this whole narrative that is all these public schools are terrible and all the people are just trying to hurt our children and things like that. And so I wrote a little response and got a lot of good feedback from folks saying, yeah, thank you so much. Teachers saying thank you for standing up for us because no one seems to be doing that. And so kind of planted that idea in my head. Maybe there was something there for us to do. But then in the failure of 779, definitely thought, boy, we're just not getting any forward motion on this. And so I reached out to a group in Texas that I'd heard of, Pastors for Texas Children. They had a pastor and groups of pastors that were advocating for public school kids. And he said, funny thing, in the email back to me, he said, yeah, I want to meet with you, but funny thing, there's a pastor out of Norman that contacted me today as well. Wow. Could you go down there and let's do a conference call? So 3 pastors, one from Tuttle, one from Norman, and myself, we all met, and we had this conference call with Pastors for Texas Children. And it was so interesting because we were serving different kinds of churches in different contexts, and we all had this shared vision of like, it felt good to be like, you're not crazy, right? Because I mean, at first I was like, am I crazy? Am I really seeing this? And then as we got into it, we had our first meeting, I think in January of 2017, where we just said, First Baptist Oklahoma City hosted us, and we just kind of put a call out there like, hey, if there's any pastors interested in this, we had about 50 people show up. And so we're like, okay, so we're not crazy, and this really is happening in a multitude of different kinds of contexts. We had pastors come from small towns. We had pastors come from the metro area. And we thought, okay, there's something to this. Maybe we need to be a positive voice. And that was really our first kind of beginning, was just to be a positive voice in almost as a parry to the kind of vitriol out there against our teachers and against our public schools, that we just had a complete disconnect from that idea that that's what was going on in our public schools. Yeah,
and you've been active since then, particularly during the teacher walkout. Yeah. I mean, I remember, I think it was the Sunday before that you and other pastors had led a prayer vigil at the Capitol, kind of, you know, in the eye of the calm before the storm that ended up being.
Well, so that was actually or was that, halfway through.
That was the Sunday after the first week.
Yeah, I had. So I actually got the flu on Easter, so I wasn't there for the first part of the walkout. I came in and we did that halfway through. It was before the start of the second week.
To the eye of the storm then.
And it was kind of trying to be, well, we just thought like 30 or 40 people would come, to be honest with you. I mean, we didn't have permits or anything, and I don't know about permits or anything. I remember that night the Oklahoma Highway Patrolman saying, "Where's your permit?" And I'm like, This is when I'm going to jail. This is going to be it. This is going to be my one time. So, but no, it was fine, and a lot more people showed up even after we started. But it was intended to be, kind of just a breather to me, just kind of a thing of because you work in this, and I am new to all this politics stuff, but just so much energy, and everybody gets at each other, and we forget to think about that we're really all working towards similar goals. It may not be the same goals, but there's similar goals. And even in that week of walkout, there's crazy things being said by all kinds of different people. And it was just kind of like, let's put the focus back on this. I mean, clearly we felt like we needed divine intervention to come up with a plan at all because there was gridlock. It just felt like, I remember saying that night, there's gridlock. And I just kind of introduced it. We had lots of other pastors pray and speak and sing that night. But I just remember thinking, we need something to break this up. It didn't feel like it was going to get broken up just by people talking at each other anymore. Yeah.
Well, you're right. At that time, it did seem like it was going to take a miracle, so to speak, to end it. I'm curious. Well, first off, now you are the executive director of this organization. Right. You guys have officially become a nonprofit,
right?
And so doing more to kind of organize yourself. What does that look like?
So the biggest idea, I think, is to have a network approach. We don't have dues or anything like that. You say nonprofit, but it's really zero anything right now, right? I mean, we're more passion than anything. And the main idea is just to help pastors network across the state and help other pastors that kind of maybe felt the same way we did, like, am I in this alone? Is there anybody rationally speaking out for our school kids? Because not to mention the teachers in our churches, there's hundreds of school kids in our churches, and we see the effects on them when they don't have proper resources. But the interesting thing I've found is whether you're suburban or urban or rural, all of this education, public schooling, really affects all those children in different ways, in profoundly different ways. But there are different things happening in those communities. And so it doesn't matter if I talk to a pastor in a small town, southern Oklahoma, or I talk to someone from Tulsa area, or I talk to someone in inner city Oklahoma City, or suburban context, they're all saying, we see a need here to advocate, to stand up for our kids. Especially when those negative voices were out there. Now, I would say the walkout definitely kind of soothed a little bit of that. It kind of got unpopular to be quite as ugly anymore. But at the same time, there's still that kind of underpinning of what do we do about this and how do we help? And so we just want to be a positive voice to say, we have 700,000 children in public schools in Oklahoma. That's not going to go away anytime soon. And so when you overlook that or you push other things in front of that, what you're really doing is you're really cutting off the growth engine of your state. You're cutting off the moral choices of your state. We talk about that a lot, that these are things that are moral decisions as well. And so for pastors, it aligns with our understanding of theology, even of what we should be advocating for and doing in our state. Yeah.
I'm curious for you, to kind of get more into the politics side of things.
Okay.
I mean, so there are pastors who are involved in politics, and there are some that are, they're sometimes it seems like their church is based around politics.
Right.
There are some that stay away from it as much as they can.
Right.
What was that process like for you, kind of weighing into this? Because when you get into the political sphere, you are forced into boxes. You are forced into the left or the right or Democrat or Republican. And I imagine you've tried to, communicate a bipartisan element, but how successful has that been?
Well, I'm actually very partisan, and so I'm just on the side of kids. That's what I always say. So I'm like, we don't really care what kind of party, because as we've seen, I mean, if you really dig into this, it doesn't really matter if you call yourself a Republican or a Democrat. There's folks that have pushed terrible agendas on public education forever, and so that is almost meaningless anymore. It's really what does your voting record look like towards kids? What does it look like? What do you advocate for? And then I think we saw in the walkout, how do you talk to teachers? How do you talk to your constituents? The things that were being said were just insulting and ignorant most of the time when you heard things being said in teachers' faces, and you're like, these are the people that are wiping the little kids' noses. These are the kids that are being taken care of every day by these teachers, and you're treating our teachers that way. That's just ridiculous. It's not going to stand. So, in order to answer your question a little better, though, you're right. It's, hopefully I come across like that. I'm a novice in this. Yeah, it's totally different and new, and I'm not good at politics, and I probably never will be, right? That's not something that I'm interested in. And so as an advocate, I have the freedom to do that. And I also realize we have an incredible freedom because we get to stay in one wheelhouse that we're very connected to. we talk about this idea of churches and families and local public schools as being kind of the core of communities in Oklahoma, no matter the size.
Yeah.
And so we're innately tied to that system of understanding of what community looks like and what it's all about. So when you talk about that, for us, it's not difficult to advocate for children. Boxes as far as politics, I would agree that there's a real danger, I think, there of being pushed one way or another. And of course, it's a lot easier for our critics to say, well, you're this or you're that.
Yeah.
And I just kind of sit back and chuckle because those just kind of fall off of us like water because we know who we are as pastors. We know, and people know us. They know our track records in these towns of taking care of people, meeting physical needs, meeting spiritual needs. So the insults that might come out or something like that about, well, you're a left group or you're a right group or whatever, none of that really matters to us because we know what our mission is. And I would say that's one of our strengths, and that I've found is we're really well defined as to what we're doing. Pastors for Oklahoma Kids is looking out for these kids things. We're looking out for children, and as a result of that, the teachers flow into that because the teacher is right there with the kids. So, I think it's very easy to define that. We have folks from mainline churches, we have folks from liberal churches, and we have folks from very conservative churches all working on the same thing, which to me, I always think, I'm telling people that's amazing because you don't see that in anything hardly. I mean, even in doing good things, usually, projects where you want to do missions work or something, you hardly ever see all three groups working together. So to me, I'm really excited about it because of that, because we see we have leadership in all of those realms working on one thing. Yeah. And to me, it's really interesting.
Yeah, and I imagine probably not a coincidence you're wearing a purple tie, maybe.
It is.
Okay.
It's just a coincidence. Okay. Yeah.
And a lot of times when we talk about religion and politics, I think more times than not, it's focused on kind of the extreme right element.
Sure.
And that's not a completely fair depiction of all people, of all religious people involved in politics, because you see there are ministers who are Democrats that are serving in the legislature, and you see churches that are, like you said, that are liberal or conservative. But a lot of times when we talk about religion and politics, we're talking about social issues, whether it's same-sex marriage, abortion, those kind of things. It's usually not so much involved in like tax policy,
correct,
and funding and that kind of thing. But you guys have kind of tried to inject religion a little bit into that, saying that we have kind of a moral imperative. I'm curious, how would you kind of talk about Oklahoma as a whole, the religious community as a whole, which is diverse, but if we're particularly talking about that kind of evangelical strain that's been a force in Oklahoma politics, has there been kind of a shift at all, do you think, in what's top of mind for them? I mean, are we seeing a movement away from social issues to looking at these issues of sometimes that are referred to as social justice? I mean, how would you kind of talk about that? Yeah,
so I think for me personally, it felt very eye-opening, and it continues to feel eye-opening just because I felt like I was keeping my head down and trying to do my job in my little zone, if you will. And I've talked to a lot of teachers that have kind of echoed the same thing. Keep our head down, do our job, do it as well as we can with the resources the state gives us. And I felt like as a pastor, and a lot of pastors identify with this as well, we're trying to do that same thing and kind of hope that everyone does the right thing up in Oklahoma City in order to make that all work together. And then when we kind of found out that wasn't true, and we tried to have conversations with these people, and they shut their doors, or they mocked us, or they just said, this is the way it is, you don't know what you're talking about, that was very eye-opening. And so it continues to be eye-opening. I mean, we're learning things. Some of us, this is the first time we're learning some of these, like the article series that you did on where Oklahoma's falling short. I think for me, reading that, I was like, I had no clue the other areas were that hurting. Yeah. And if you want to talk about, I think it might be a little much to say that we're injecting religion into the budgeting process, but I think definitely what we're trying to do is say there's a principle taught even in the New Testament where Jesus says, where your treasure is, there your heart is also. He doesn't say that the money follows your heart. He says where your money is, that's your clear indication of where your heart really is. And so pastors, I've heard them joke about that before. You want to tell someone's priorities, don't ask them what their priorities are, but say, let me see your checkbook, and we'll show you what your priorities are. If we apply that principle, so we're not saying that's a mandate or anything, we have no budget vision for that, other than to say, that's a principle taught in the scriptures, and if we go look at our budget, then that is a moral document because it does say what we favor most. And so if we have a 5 or 10 year plan for roads and bridges, but we have no plan for our public schools, clearly we have our priorities out of whack. To me, that's to me, and I think to most regular Oklahomans who are keeping their heads down, doing the work in their area, and expecting everyone else to do the right thing. I think that's kind of what we hit on, and that story that I've told and talked about to different people, that they just weren't paying attention in a lot of ways because they just kind of thought politics is its thing, education's its thing, the school's its thing, church is its thing, and we'll all do the right thing and everything will work out. And then you find out some strings are being pulled, and of course, who knows how all that works, but the folks that are up here definitely need to be able to have a conversation with the people back home and say, this is why I'm making decisions that are affecting your public school. This is why we're cutting funding in January that we promised you was going to be there in August or June or July. And so those conversations were not happening, and that's still concerning to me.
Yeah. So an email you sent me this week, talking to me a little bit about the formation of the nonprofit and your new role as executive director. I think you also referred, you were talking about kind of your own, background and called yourself, at least in somewhat kind of conservative on some issues, theology, stuff like that. Tell me a little bit about. I don't want to put you on. I'm going to put you on the spot about, what candidates do you support, what issues, and that kind of thing. I'm curious to get your perspective as someone, you're the pastor of Coffee Creek, a church, which is located in Edmond. Would you kind of characterize this as kind of a conservative, progressive, kind of a moderate? I'm going somewhere with this, but I want you to kind of tell me a little bit about your congregation.
So, we're a very interesting church. We're very different. We're a Southern Baptist church. So all my schooling, was here at OBU, and then at Southwestern in Fort Worth, and in Midwestern in Kansas City. So all of my background is in Southern Baptist church. But at the same time, we have a lot of people from different backgrounds. And so I don't know that we would call ourselves progressive or anything like that. I don't think the titles work for us really, but I would say we're definitely open to having conversations and looking at people and looking at perspectives and saying, how can we be involved in doing things that are good instead of just kind of sticking with a party line or any group's line that tells us kind of how to be.
Yeah, and so, but being kind of part of the Southern Baptist tradition, which is definitely a big force here in Oklahoma, I'm curious from your perspective, how would, what are the political conversations taking place in your congregation or kind of in your circle? How are people viewing this year's election? Once again, I'm not asking you to pick a candidate for governor and that kind of thing, but how would you explain the conversation that's taking place when you hear it, in your congregation or in the homes that you visit in kind of your circle?
So I think the biggest thing that comes out of it, from what I've kind of understood and wrapped my head around, is no one's checking a box for a political party. We've kind of realized the emptiness and the bankruptcy there of saying, I vote one party, I vote one way. And I think there is a lot of people that are saying, we've got to really listen to these people and hear where they're coming from and what their background is, because we don't know anymore what the Republican Party is going to do, what the Democratic Party is going to do, and Libertarian now on the ballot too. So it's like what you stand for as a candidate may not line up exactly with what a platform is. And doesn't that make more sense anyway? That's where we're coming from, is doesn't that make more sense anyway than having some national group hand the values down to us? As a Southern Baptist, one of the most interesting things about us, I think, is that we are different than other denominations. We're supposed to be from the bottom up led instead of the top down led. And so our automatic understanding is the autonomy of the local churches, right? So they stand on their own. I think most Oklahomans, at least that's my vision of being a lifelong Oklahoman, is that that's how politics is supposed to work too, from the bottom up. We're kind of having leaders and electing leaders that are going to do the will of the people. When you hand a platform down and say everybody has to sign off on this, to me that's a violation of that idea. It's a violation. And people say, well, it's for ease so that we can have a template of what everyone agrees with. If it's not working, clearly it's not everyone going to agree with that one concept. And so I would say there's things in the parties that they have picked on, issues and things that are just not important to the folks back home. And there are some things that they're not addressing, clearly, education being one of those, that are very important, and we're kind of beating our chest saying, why aren't you listening to us? Why aren't you hearing us on these issues? So to me, the biggest thing is just people aren't going to vote straight ticket. That they're talking about, I'm going to evaluate each candidate and I'm going to vote for the one that is going to represent me. Yeah,
it's interesting can you say that, because a lot of times these social issues that have sometimes been the dominant force in how that part of the electorate is voted are a lot of times not really that relevant to people's personal lives. You talk about education, especially where you're from, and the local school is a big deal. A lot of people moved there, particularly for the local school, are deeply invested and connected to their local schools.
That's true.
Do you feel like is that a product of just kind of a new generation coming up? You've seen that shift intergenerationally, or just how would what's the cause of that, do you think?
Yeah, I think definitely with the 30 and younger crowd that we work with, it's one of the interesting things. We had a group this last week, and I was talking about reading the paper, and they were like, "What's a paper?" And they were joking, but I read it online, or I read it on Twitter or whatever, and I was like, no, you got to stay involved here. But the one thing that they're not accepting of is the authority from someone just because they have an elected office, or even just because they're a pastor, right? So it's like they're not just accepting of authority. The younger folks are wanting to say, let's see what the proof is. How are you proving that you are relevant? How are you proving that you are worthy of that title or that office, that I should even have any listening, I should give you any voice in my life? And I think that's interesting, and I think that is a shift. We took for a long time, it feels like we took an authoritative view, and someone would say, well, this is who I am, this is the party I represent, so we'd say, okay, we have to just agree with this person, no matter what their life looks like, or if their actions back up what they're saying, we just kind of go with it, and that's a different shift. I'm not sure that's going to happen soon, but I think if the younger people will start voting, then I think that will happen more quickly. But what I did see that was interesting with the walkout, I think, is it used to be, I think you could say some of those things and get away with it and just be like, oh, well, that's old so-and-so. And we saw that's not, with all the incumbents that got knocked out, some of the folks that were saying some of the worst stuff to our teachers, you got to be at least respectful to these people, even if you disagree. I never have a problem with someone that disagrees with me, but I'm like, can we have a conversation?
Yeah.
Can we just talk about the ideas instead of name calling, instead of labeling people? Can we have a conversation about the real ideas? Because there are real ideas to talk about. It's just sometimes people are fearful that their idea might not have as much support, and it might not be as strong of an idea. And so I think a lot of time they default to name call. You don't call a teacher an extortionist if you want to have a conversation. You could say, look, I don't agree with them being here, but when you go into that, it shows the weakness of your argument to me. So.
Yeah, it's interesting. You and I are both in the institution business, and those are definitely somewhat under attack in some ways. Whether we're talking about legacy newspapers, or the church in a variety of ways,
Absolutely.
or just authority figures. So yeah, I think that's an interesting point. Finally here as we wrap up, I'm curious for you. As you've gotten more involved in politics as a pastor, what's been the cost for you? And I say that because it was last week or a couple weeks ago before the runoff, and I didn't even mention this yet, but you put out a video about that there was a national pro-school choice group that had sent out a bunch of flyers in some races in your neighborhood, and you put up this video of just wanting to find the answers. Actually went to the address listed on there to try to get someone to respond, and it was kind of a clever way of showing that this is an outside group, we don't know who's behind it, that kind of thing. As people know you, still know you as a pastor, but also now know you as kind of a political activist in some regards. How's that changed things for you?
I think the most difficult thing probably is communication, is making sure that you communicate what the purpose is behind that, because there's some room for miscommunication. What are you doing now? Is this about becoming a politician? I've had so many people, are you running for office? And I'm like, you know me. If you know me, you know I have zero interest in that ever. But with the video in particular, it was interesting because people were like, they mostly saw it as kind of this bumbling guy trying to go find out what is really going on, and it was almost Mr. Smith Goes to Washington kind of revelation, because I authentically didn't know what I was going to find. I thought maybe there would be someone locally here that I could talk to, and I wanted to say, hi, I'm with Pastors for Oklahoma Kids. You're a kids group apparently. Who are you? I've never heard. I've been doing this for 2 years. I've never seen you. That didn't happen. And so, but you're right. I think it's stressful. I think people have to know you and know really what your intentions are. And then I think being very clear in communication that this is not about being partisan. It's not about, we don't support candidates or either party or anything like that, but putting out information and saying, look, this is really affecting kids, whether it's affecting urban kids or it's affecting suburban kids or rural kids in Oklahoma. These are big things. And when people make these decisions, we at least need to make sure the voice of the people it's affecting are being heard. And that's really what we're trying to do. And as I said before, stand up for our teachers and things, and just an unfair attacks on our schools. Yeah.
And finally, so how do you guys plan to be involved in this election this year?
Yeah, so, and back to the walkout too, again, that wasn't expected. So that kind of, we had to shift everything at that point. Prior to that, I'd only been to the Capitol one time that session, and was just trying to be a voice for the 700,000 kids. So again, advocacy, I think just keeping that at the forefront. saying to our legislators, and especially with so many new folks coming in, letting them know who we are, and just letting them know, we're there to just offer another perspective on what our teachers are doing and the activity of our schools. And we're there to be, honestly, Will Rogers said it that way one time. He said, we can't all be heroes, that some people have to sit on the curb and clap as the parade goes by. And I think that's kind of our job, is we're there to kind of clap on and for the kids in the parade, for the teachers, and say, look at this good work being done, and look at, with the few resources we have, look at what's being accomplished, and what could we do if we really got behind them.
Yeah, well, this is definitely a time where we're seeing people who have not been involved in politics get involved in ways like you just talked about yourself. And during the walkout, heard so many people say this was their first time at the Capitol, or at least the only time they've been there is to take wedding photos or something like that. So this is definitely, as we've talked about in this show before, a really interesting year for Oklahoma politics. And we'll have to see in November what kind of election shifts we see, but the involvement of people, especially those who haven't necessarily been deeply involved, is already really evident, and it's going to be interesting to watch this year. So Clark Frailey with Pastors for Oklahoma Kids, thanks so much for coming on the show. We really appreciate it. That's going to do it for this week's episode of Political State from the Oklahoman. We'll be back next week. Maybe I can get Dale and Justin to actually get back into the studio with us. But for the Oklahoman, I'm Ben. We'll see you next Friday.